If you're so clever, farm girl, solve this. The morning air in Bakersfield shimmered, not with heat yet, but with the promise of it. The arid sun had not fully risen, yet the earth already sighed with desiccated breath, as if each blade of grass held its own whispered story of drought. Within room 7 of Sequoia Middle School, however, something deeper than disquiet was amiss. The air carried a hush born not of tranquility, but of careful, uncanny restraint. Clara Reed, 10 years old, stood at the back of the classroom. A silent sentinel. Her body refused to seat itself. Another protest of pain against her young frame. Scars of discipline branded her back, 5-lined echoes of a rigid ruler's name for order. Yet today those marks were hidden beneath the tender folds of her blouse. They were reminders, too visible for comfort, of a lesson taught not with kindness, but with fear. Miss Harding was a woman carved from austerity and convention. Her hair, pulled back with unyielding precision, framed a face etched with the lines of old curriculum and long-standing authority. Her presence was a monument to order, her voice a ledger that never allowed exceptions. Clara found it difficult to sit beneath that stare, not because she lacked respect, but because respect felt like a shackle every day, heavy and unbending. Finally, the teacher paused mid-lesson, turning her steely gaze toward the lone standing figure. "Sit down," she ordered. It was not a question. It carried the crisp authority of a command, practiced countless times, needing no softness. But Clara did not move. She lowered her eyes. An unconscious hum in the room seemed to swell. A few students glanced at each other, their looks a curious blend of sympathy and apprehension. The tension stretched taut, an unspoken question plucked from the air. Why was she still standing? Miss Harding took a step closer, her voice softening only to sharpen. "I asked you to sit. Do you think you're too smart to follow rules?" Clara, silent and unmoving, offered no answer. The room held its breath. There was a long pause, pregnant with expectation or perhaps dread. The teacher, compelled by a need to reassert control or perhaps to prove something, strode to the chalkboard. With deliberate assertion, she scrawled a complex challenge, an academic mountain Clara had never formally studied. Then she spoke, each word measured and cold. "If you're so clever, farm girl, solve this." A ripple of laughter, scattered in tone, hesitant, spread through the room. It was mockery folded in awkwardness, the kind of laughter that tries to mask discomfort. But Clara heard none of this. The world narrowed to her and the board, to the silent bond between a child's mind and ideas it had met only in stolen moments at the dusty public library. Clara stepped forward. No hesitation, no consult. Even her legs did not tremble. It was as though the knowledge resided somewhere deep, below shame, beyond fear. She climbed the small stairs to reach the board, her hand grasping the chalk. Her breath came softly. Her voice did not speak a word. Each letter written was a careful placement, thought tracing along lines not only of logic but of longing. To teach them, these witnesses, to see beyond their assumptions, to know that where one comes from does not determine the expanse of what one can fathom. She wrote. Every symbol and stroke carried clarity, not for show, but for honesty. No flourish, only precision. When she had finished, she laid chalk aside and turned from the board, her eyes steady, serene. Silence followed, full and absolute. Time itself paused. Miss Harding lurched forward as one awakened from a trance. Her face, unreadable, bore no triumph nor acknowledgement, no rush of indignation, just a stillness that felt thicker than any response. Then, with resignation wrapped in habitual authority, the teacher tore a page from her lesson log. "Back to your seat." Clara did not move. Not yet. She felt too exposed to return so quickly. A lone figure in a deserted landscape of unspoken verdicts. Her mind braced for rejection, for disbelief. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she turned. Her small frame carried heaviness unseen. She let her gaze brush past the chalkboard, across rows of desks, to the faces filled with uncertainty. She paused at one set of eyes, not cold, not mocking, just small and brave. Aisha, who often sat with Clara in the library, lifted her hand, just once, and rested it on the desk, not raised to ask or to answer, but simply as a gesture. Her whispered words barely carried beyond her own breath. "I believe you." Only 4 words, but enough to anchor Clara's spirit. Enough to tell her she wasn't invisible. Clara nodded slightly, gratitude soft as dawn in the curve of her lips. That small affirmation gave her what she needed to pivot, to walk away. The echo of possibility now flowing through her as though she carried new marrow, coursing gentle and strong through her veins. She passed back toward the door. Every step was measured, slow, sure, imbued with quiet reckoning. Behind her, the room stirred. Not with resentment, not with mockery, but with a dawning recognition, like night's reluctant letting go. Boys and girls watched her leave. Some held their breath. Others clutched at questions they could not yet ask, but none turned away. Beyond the threshold, the hallway yawned wide. Clara pressed her palm against the cool wall, gathering composure. She breathed in the musty scent of floor polish and old lockers. She tasted freedom, not of liberation, but of possibility. Not victory, but of validation. She walked away without looking back, because she already had what mattered most. She had spoken through chalk and silence. She had answered without words. She had taken a small spark of belief and carried it forward. Behind her, still in that classroom, an idea had been planted. A young genius had whispered back to the world, "Here I am, and I am not unseen." The door closed behind her with a soft clack, not a slam. Not loud enough to signal drama, just final. Clara stood for a moment in the empty corridor, the hush around her as steady as her breath. The bell hadn't rung yet. Class was still in session. The world, it seemed, was still caught in the moment she had left behind. But inside her, time had not stopped. It was moving too quickly. She did not cry. She hadn't cried when the ruler met her skin. She hadn't cried when the boots of other children stepped on her notebooks in the cafeteria. She hadn't cried when her mother came home late, hands cracked, shoulders bent, bringing home oranges and silence. Today would not be the day. The office at the far end of the hallway glowed with the tired light of overused fluorescent bulbs. Clara walked toward it with the steady steps of someone who knows how to survive the long walk. The walk from misunderstanding to judgment, from desk to detention, from bored to blame. As she reached the office, the secretary, a kind woman named Mrs. Del Valle, who wore thick glasses and smelled faintly of lavender, looked up, startled. "Oh, honey, what happened?" she asked softly. Clara didn't answer. She didn't have the words yet, and even if she did, they would not have sounded right in her mouth. She sat quietly on the bench, hands folded in her lap. A single smudge of chalk still clung to her thumb. The door to the principal's office opened 10 minutes later. Principal Ramirez was a tall man with tired eyes. He had once taught history, and still wore his old corduroy jackets like he'd forgotten the world moved on. He looked at Clara with a cautious gentleness, like someone approaching a bird with a broken wing. "I heard there was a situation," he began, motioning for her to come in. She followed him inside. There was a long silence as he settled behind his desk, opened a thin folder with her name on it. She had no real record, no fights, no cheating, no late homework, just invisibility. "She says you cheated," he said after a while. Clara looked up. For a moment her eyes met his. "She said no child your age could solve that problem," he added, softer now, "and that you must have memorized it, or copied it, or been coached." "I didn't," Clara said, her voice small but unwavering. "I believe you," Principal Ramirez said after a pause, "but I need more than belief right now. I need understanding." He looked at her, not like a principal, but like a father who hadn't been told how to help. Then something shifted in his gaze. "Clara," he asked gently, "why didn't you sit down?" She hesitated, and then slowly, with trembling hands, she lifted the back of her shirt. A bruise, deep and blue-black, spread across the fragile curve of her spine. Older marks ran beside it, faded but not gone. For a moment, Ramirez said nothing. The air felt too still for breathing. He stood up, walked to the window, then returned. He sat down, hands folded. "I'm going to speak to the district," he said quietly. "And I'm going to arrange a test for you, a formal one, supervised, fair, public." Clara nodded. "Would you be willing?" he asked. "Not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right." She nodded again. That night, Clara didn't tell her mother what had happened. Her mother had enough to carry. There were bills on the counter, fruit boxes stacked beside the fridge, and a silence in the kitchen that came not from distance, but from exhaustion. Clara sat in the corner of the small living room, rewriting the steps of the problem in a lined notebook. Not to memorize it, but to make sure it had meaning. Each step had to belong to her. When her mother passed by, she paused. "You're working late again," she said gently. Clara nodded. "Just something I did wrong today." Her mother didn't ask more. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, a hand rough from pruning vines and lifting crates, but warm. The next morning, Clara returned to school. Not to class, straight to the auditorium. The principal had arranged it quickly. Word had spread faster than he intended. There were more people than he expected, a few teachers, a few curious parents, and 3 people seated at the front table. One was a math teacher from the high school, one was Ramirez himself, and the third, Clara didn't recognize him at first. An older man, maybe in his 60s, tall, thin, with a quiet stillness about him. He wore no badge, no tie, just a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up. His hair was silver, but his eyes were young. They followed Clara the moment she walked in. He didn't speak, just nodded, as if he had been expecting her for a long time. They gave her a table, blank paper, and 3 questions. They gave her silence, and Clara began. She worked slowly, not to impress, but to understand. She wasn't rushing to prove. She was building, step by step, line by line. She didn't glance up once, not even when the whispers began among the observers, not even when the older man leaned forward, folding his hands. 40 minutes later, she finished. Then, quietly, she added 2 more ways to solve the same problem. Not because anyone asked, but because she could. When she finally looked up, the auditorium had changed. There was stillness now, but it wasn't cold. It felt held, like something fragile had been caught mid-fall and gently returned to the earth. The man in the white shirt stood up. "My name," he said, "is Dr. Alan Torres. I used to teach mathematics at Cal State Bakersfield." He looked at Clara. "She is not coached. She is not memorizing. She is not cheating. What you've seen today is clarity. What you've seen is a gift." The room was silent. Miss Harding, standing at the back, turned slowly and walked away. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply left. No applause followed. Only silence. But for the first time, it was a silence Clara did not fear. It was a silence that felt like being seen. After the test, Clara sat alone in the courtyard, beneath a jacaranda tree that had long since given up blooming. The bench beneath her was cracked, its paint peeling like tired skin. A breeze rustled through dry leaves, but offered no shade from the weight in her chest. She wasn't waiting for congratulations. She wasn't hoping for vindication. She only wanted silence now. True silence, the kind that didn't follow humiliation or suspicion, but simply came from being allowed to exist. Her fingers curled around the edge of her notebook, still smudged with chalk dust. She turned a page but didn't write. She had nothing left to prove on paper. A quiet voice approached. It was Principal Ramirez. "Clara," he said softly, sitting beside her, careful not to startle. "Can I speak with you?" She nodded, not looking up. "I want to thank you," he said. "What you did yesterday, it mattered." She said nothing. He paused as if weighing whether to continue. "There's going to be a meeting," he said. "The district, parents, teachers, they want to understand what happened. They want to hear your side." Clara blinked. Her eyes were tired. "I don't have a side," she said, almost in a whisper. "I just did what I knew." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly why they need to hear from you." She hesitated, then asked, "Will she be there? Miss Harding?" "Yes," he said gently. "Will she tell them I lied?" "I don't think she'll say anything," he answered honestly. "But that won't stop others from thinking it." Silence settled again. Clara stared at her hands. Small, brown, dusted with graphite and memories. She'd seen her mother's hands like this, stained after a day on the field, working for hours, picking fruit others would eat without knowing who had touched it first. Then she asked something unexpected. "Can I bring my notebook?" Ramirez smiled. "Yes. Bring anything that helps you feel strong." The town meeting was held in the same auditorium, but it felt different now. Not like a trial, not like a test, just heavy. Like the space had been asked to carry too much. Parents filled the rows, students too. The vice superintendent, Mr. Enfield, stood at the podium with a clipboard. Clara sat in the front row beside Principal Ramirez, her notebook held tightly to her chest. Across the aisle, Miss Harding sat with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. The first half of the meeting passed with calm statements. The district read a policy statement about discipline, about academic honesty. Ramirez gave a clear, soft summary of what had happened. Then they opened the floor. A boy stood first, Benji, from Clara's class. He shifted nervously. She answered something none of us could. But she didn't look proud," he said. "She just looked like she'd done it before." Someone else rose, a teacher from another class. "It's not about whether the math was right or wrong," she said. "It's about how quickly we call a child a liar when their gift doesn't fit what we expect." Then, to everyone's surprise, a girl in a long red hoodie stood up. It was Aisha. "I saw her back," Aisha said, voice clear and firm. "The marks. From the ruler. I didn't say anything that day. I should have." A ripple moved through the room. Then, after a long pause, a voice came from the rear. Older, deeper, worn. It was Dr. Alan Torres. "I retired from Cal State 2 years ago," he said. "In that time, I've seen perhaps 5 students at the university who could solve a problem like that intuitively. I've seen one 10-year-old who could do it while being treated like a fraud." He let the silence settle. Genius doesn't ask permission, he continued. It just needs room. Clara's hands trembled slightly. She had not expected anyone to speak for her. All her life she had been her own voice, her own witness. Now someone had joined the sound. Then someone from the district leaned forward. "Clara," the woman said kindly, "do you want to speak?" She stood slowly. Her legs felt distant, like borrowed limbs. She walked to the podium with small, measured steps, her notebook still pressed to her heart. "I didn't want to show off," she began. "I didn't even want to be right. I just didn't want them to laugh at something I know." Her voice was small but steady. "I saw that problem before," she said, glancing at the board. "Not at school. In a book at the public library. I didn't understand it at first. I read it maybe 20 times. But then one night it made sense. And after that I couldn't forget it." She looked toward Miss Harding, but without anger. Only clarity. "When she asked me to solve it, I didn't think. I just did what I remembered, what I understood. Not to prove anything, just because it was already in me." Her fingers tightened on the notebook. "I don't want a scholarship," she said. "I don't want to be called a genius. I just want a quiet desk, and a teacher who doesn't think I'm lying." Silence filled the auditorium. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm. The superintendent leaned over, whispered something to Principal Ramirez. He nodded. Then from the podium, "The district finds no wrongdoing by Clara Reed. We apologize for the harm caused and recognize the failure of the disciplinary approach." Then, even quieter, "Miss Harding has submitted her resignation." There was no applause. Just the long, soft breath of justice. Clara returned to her seat. Her notebook rested now on her lap, open, unafraid. That night she walked home under a sky that had always felt too large. But for the first time, she wasn't small beneath it. She was part of it. The folding chairs had been set up in neat rows by the janitor at 6 a.m., still smelling faintly of lemon polish and the faint trace of dust that never fully left Bakersfield air. The cafeteria had been converted overnight. The long lunch tables folded away, replaced by a single desk at the front, plain, wooden, facing out toward the gathered crowd. Behind it, 3 men sat at a long table like quiet sentinels. Clara walked in alone. She wore a collared shirt too big for her frame and borrowed black shoes that clacked softly on the tile floor. In her hands, she held only a pencil and the old blue notebook that had, over time, become part of her. She had not eaten that morning. She rarely did when her mind was full. The room was filled, teachers, parents, students, a few reporters, but Clara saw none of them. Her eyes found the desk first, then slowly moved to the 3 faces waiting for her. Mr. Haywood, the high school math teacher, offered a thin smile, polite but uncertain. Principal Ramirez nodded, warmly but professionally, and seated in the middle was the man she remembered from the auditorium, Dr. Alan Torres. No introduction necessary now. He was part of the story. Ramirez stood first. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "This is not a trial. This is a classroom, a special one, perhaps, but still a place to learn. Clara Reed has been invited to solve a set of problems, supervised and fairly presented, in the presence of this community." Then he turned to Clara, his voice softer. "Clara, you may begin whenever you're ready." No time limit, no rules spoken, just her and a blank sheet of paper. She sat down, legs barely reaching the floor. The silence was kind this time. Curious, yes, but not cruel. Mr. Haywood passed her the first problem. She glanced at it. Then she nodded. She didn't begin by writing. She sat quietly, holding the pencil loosely between her fingers. 1 minute, 2. To an untrained eye, it looked like hesitation. But Dr. Torres knew better. It was the pause of someone who understood that thinking wasn't the same as remembering. She wasn't replaying something she had memorized. She was listening, inside her own mind, for the shape of the idea. Then she wrote. Slowly, clearly. No erasing, no circling back. Her work was neat, but not performative. It didn't shout. It unfolded. The pencil moved, paused, moved again, each motion deliberate. Not a race, but a conversation between thought and page. After 20 minutes, she placed the first page aside and accepted the second. It was more abstract, requiring logical deduction, pattern recognition. This time she smiled, just faintly. The kind of smile that says, "I've seen this before. Even if not here, not now." As she solved, the room changed. At first, people fidgeted, whispered, stole glances at their phones. But as time stretched, something quieter took hold. It was reverence. Not the loud kind, not applause or headlines, but the kind felt in old libraries or long-forgotten churches, where the very act of witnessing becomes sacred. 45 minutes passed. She finished the last problem, then turned the paper over. On the back, she drew a small diagram. Not required, not requested. Just a visual explanation. A gesture, almost, of teaching, as if saying, "This is how I see it. Maybe it helps you too." Dr. Torres leaned forward, studying her work. He said nothing. Principal Ramirez read each page carefully, brow furrowed not in doubt, but in growing awe. Mr. Haywood looked lost. Not confused, but outpaced. The kind of face a teacher wears when a student surpasses what the curriculum prepares for. When Clara stood, she said nothing. She simply placed the pencil down and walked back to her chair. The silence held. Then Dr. Torres stood. "I taught for 32 years, he began. "I've graded over 10,000 exams. I've seen brilliance that was loud, and brilliance that was hidden. What you saw today was clarity born from solitude." He looked down at the paper, then back at Clara. "Not one error," he said. "Not even in method." The room exhaled, and then, from somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. Slowly. Not in celebration, but in recognition. Others followed. It was not thunderous. It was not the clapping of a sporting event. It was something softer. A sound made not to congratulate, but to acknowledge. Clara didn't bow. She didn't smile. She just looked down at her notebook and held it to her chest. But her eyes shone, not with pride, but with peace. Someone had seen her. Outside the cafeteria, under the same jacaranda tree from days before, Clara sat again. This time, not to retreat, just to breathe. Dr. Torres joined her. He didn't sit at first, just stood, hands in pockets. "I used to be a child like you," he said. She looked up, surprised. "Not in Bakersfield," he continued, "and not with your strength. But I remember what it felt like to be doubted. It does something to the spine." She nodded. "I also remember," he added, "the first person who didn't doubt me. I remember their name, their shoes, their breath. That's how rare it was." He finally sat beside her. "You'll have choices, Clara. Offers, attention, maybe even cameras." She winced slightly at that. He smiled. "But none of that matters. What matters is that you know. What's in you is not for applause. It's for building, for healing, for offering to others one day. She looked at her notebook. I don't want to leave my school, she said, or my mom. You don't have to. I just want a quiet place, she added, and maybe a better desk. He laughed. I think that can be arranged. They sat together for a long time, saying little. The jacaranda tree hadn't bloomed, but Clara noticed something she hadn't before, a single green shoot at the end of a branch. It was enough. Clara walked home that evening without hurry. Her shoes still clicked too loudly. Her hair still clung to her face from the heat. But everything felt lighter. In the distance, she could hear someone sweeping, the familiar sound of someone finishing a long day of unnoticed labor. She passed by the school fence, fingers brushing along the metal. No guards, no whispers. Just a girl with a notebook full of truth. Long before Clara solved anything on the board, long before Miss Harding wielded her ruler like truth, long before the auditorium quieted for a 10-year-old girl in borrowed shoes, Dr. Alan Torres had been watching. Not out of suspicion, out of memory. He had retired quietly from Cal State Bakersfield 2 years before. No farewell dinner, no photos framed in the hallway, just a small envelope on his desk that read, "Thank you for the years." He didn't expect more. He didn't want more. His students had called him the Clock, not for his punctuality, but for his silence. He taught mathematics like a man whispering secrets to the walls, measured, steady, as though every equation held a hidden sorrow. The truth was, it did. Dr. Torres had grown up not far from where Clara lived now, though the fields had been fuller then, and the workers fewer. His father picked almonds. His mother cleaned motels. And he, quiet, awkward, forever scribbling, had discovered math under a broken porch light with a borrowed book. He too had once stood at a chalkboard, small and shaking, in front of a teacher who didn't believe him. And it wasn't until decades later, after scholarships, degrees, lectures, and tenure, that the wound fully formed. Not the doubt itself, but the loneliness it left behind. Retirement was meant to be peace, but peace was not easy for a man who had seen too many gifted children buried under silence. So, he wandered. He visited the public library on weekends. He sat in the last row during community classes. He offered to tutor once a week, not in calculus, but in listening. And that's where he first saw her. Clara came every Thursday afternoon. She never borrowed books. She brought her own, a stack of tattered workbooks and one notebook so worn its spine had peeled. She never asked for help, never raised her voice, but she stayed for hours, scribbling, pausing, staring into space, then scribbling again. He watched from afar, never interrupting, not because he didn't care, but because he knew. Children like her, once interrupted, rarely returned. One Thursday, she tried to check out a textbook too advanced for her age. The librarian refused. "College level," she said gently. "You need a parent's permission." Clara didn't argue. She simply opened the book at the corner table and began copying page by page into her own notebook. Dr. Torres sat 2 tables away, pretending to read. And something stirred in him, old and sharp. Not pity. Recognition. After Clara's classroom incident with Miss Harding, Dr. Torres heard the whispers. A girl from Sequoia Middle had cheated on a problem even high schoolers couldn't solve. He didn't need names. He already knew. He contacted Principal Ramirez, not as a retired professor, but as a citizen. He offered to be present, quietly, as an observer, a shadow. "I believe you're dealing with something rare," he said. Ramirez paused. And if I'm not? Then you'll still have shown her dignity. After the supervised test, the moment Clara finished, pencil still warm, Dr. Torres hadn't clapped. He hadn't smiled, but his eyes had misted. He recognized not just the accuracy of her solution, but the loneliness in the way she wrote it. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being wrong, but from being right too early, too far, too alone. Later, outside under the jacaranda tree, he sat beside her, not as a scholar, not as a savior, but as something quieter, a mirror. "You remind me of someone," he said. She didn't ask who, because somehow she already knew. In the days after the test, Torres did not disappear. He returned to the library each Thursday, sat at the same table, waited. Sometimes Clara came, sometimes not. But when she did, she sat across from him. And for a long time, they didn't speak of math. They spoke of soil, of weather, of which pages in a book felt heavy and which ones felt light. When she finally asked, "Did you always want to teach?" he chuckled. "No," he said. "I just didn't want any more children to think they were wrong for being curious." She nodded, and that was the start of not a mentorship, not a program, but a quiet passing of light. One Thursday afternoon, Clara pulled a folded page from her notebook. "I tried a different method," she said, "for the same problem. Not faster, just prettier." He read it, then looked at her. "You're not solving for the answer anymore," he said. She tilted her head. "Then what am I solving for?" "Beauty," he whispered. Which is what math becomes when it stops being about proof and starts being about meaning. She smiled, small, knowing. That night, she stayed at the library an hour longer than usual, and Dr. Torres, when he finally stood to leave, placed an old compass on the table beside her. "Used it for 30 years, he said. "You'll need it." She picked it up carefully, as if it might still carry his breath. "I don't want to disappoint you," she said quietly. "You can't," he replied. "Not unless you stop being kind." And she never did. That fall, the library posted a new flyer. "Evening Math Circle. Open to all ages. Taught by Clara Reed and Dr. Alan Torres." No tuition, no grades, just space. Chairs around one long table. Some faces old, some young, most unsure. But in the middle sat Clara, no longer standing alone at a chalkboard, now seated, beside a man who had once stood there too. Together, they spoke not just of numbers, but of trust, of returning, of how sometimes, when no one else sees you, a shadow does, and stands quietly behind you until the world is ready. The Bakersfield Community Center was not meant to hold more than 100 people. But that evening they came in waves, farmers still in their dusty overalls, mothers with their children in Sunday clothes even though it wasn't Sunday, teachers with notebooks but no lesson plan. They came quietly, not to protest, not to cheer. They came to listen. And perhaps, for the first time in a long while, to speak. The meeting had been scheduled quickly, officially titled a Community Reflection Session. But everyone knew what it really was. It was about Clara, and it was about them, about a town that had watched in silence as a child was punished for knowing too much, too soon, in a voice too soft. There was no stage, just folding chairs, a wooden floor that creaked when you shifted, and a microphone at the front that whined each time someone stepped up to speak. Principal Ramirez opened the meeting with a few steady words. "We're not here to rewrite the past," he said. "We're here to understand it." and to decide what kind of place we want to be for all our children. Then he stepped aside. For a moment, no one moved. Then a small boy, maybe 9, shuffled up to the microphone. He was holding a crumpled notebook. "My name is Raphael," he said, eyes low. "Clara used to sit by me in the library sometimes. I never liked math, but once she showed me how to turn a word problem into a picture, and now I do one every Thursday." He paused. "I didn't say thank you then." He stepped back. A few murmurs moved through the room, not loud, just the sound of people adjusting something inside themselves. Then another child, a girl with 2 braids and paint on her jeans. "I used to think smart meant loud," she said. "But Clara's not loud. She's just clear." She smiled shyly. "She makes quiet feel big." Applause followed. Soft, but real. In the 3rd row, Dr. Torres sat with hands folded. He said nothing. But his eyes scanned each speaker with the reverence of a man who'd waited too long to hear this music. Miss Harding was not present. She had resigned, quietly, days earlier. No statement, no return. Some said she moved north. Others said nothing at all. But the silence she left behind was not empty anymore. It had been filled. A woman stood next. She wore a red apron, dust still clinging to her sleeves. "I don't understand integrals," she said plainly. "I didn't go to college. But I know what it feels like when people think you're lying, just because you're too tired to defend yourself." Her voice cracked. "My daughter used to come home crying from this school. Not because she failed, but because she felt invisible. Until she met Clara." She paused, hand on her chest. "She started drawing math, like it was alive." And then, carefully, "I came here tonight because if that little girl could stand up for herself, then I can stand up for her too." There was no clapping now, only silence, but the kind that holds. In the back, Aisha waited for the line to thin. Then she stepped up. She didn't use the microphone. She just spoke from where she stood. "I remember when Clara got pulled out of class," she said. "The whole room went quiet, but none of us said anything." She looked down. "Sometimes it's not the bad people who hurt you most. It's the good ones who stay quiet." Then she looked up. "I stayed quiet. I'm not anymore." She sat down, and for a long time, no one rose. When Clara finally stood, it wasn't to speak. She just walked slowly to the front and placed her notebook on the table near the microphone. Then she turned to the room. "I don't want a prize," she said. "I don't want a title." She paused. "I just want this to matter for someone else. Not me. Someone after me." A teacher in the 2nd row, Ms. Levesque, who taught English, raised her hand. "Can I use your story in my classroom?" she asked. Clara nodded. "But not just the part about the math." "What part, then?" someone asked. "The part where people changed," Clara said. "That's the best part." Later that night, the janitor turned off the lights 1 row at a time. People lingered in the dim, not quite ready to leave. At the door, a man in a baseball cap held it open for Clara. "You're the reason I want to learn again," he said. She didn't know his name, but she smiled anyway. Outside, the wind had shifted, cooler now, softer. She looked back through the glass doors and saw a town slowly stretching, like limbs long asleep, waking to something old and sacred. Belief. Not in genius, but in goodness. There was no announcement, no trumpet, no banner across the hallway proclaiming, "Justice has been served." Instead, on a Monday morning filled with ordinary things, wind in the eucalyptus, a dog barking behind the fence, the smell of chalk and cafeteria rolls, Clara Reed was quietly handed a letter. She didn't open it right away. She placed it in her backpack, next to her notebook, and walked to the library as she always did. Only later, under the flickering light of a reading lamp and the soft rustle of someone else's page turning, did she unfold it. It wasn't long, just a few lines typed on thick paper. Dear Miss Clara Reed, the Bakersfield Unified School Board, in collaboration with California State University Bakersfield, is honored to extend to you a Distinguished Young Learner Fellowship, granting full access to Cal State's Mathematics Department as a guest student, with resources, mentoring, and support at your pace, on your terms. Your desk will always be ready. Signed, Dr. Linda Morales, Chancellor. Clara read it twice, then folded it again, not to hide it, but to carry it better. That same morning, Miss Harding's nameplate was gone from room 7. The desk sat empty. No announcement had been made. No official letter had been read aloud. But a notice posted quietly on the school bulletin read, "Effective immediately, all forms of corporal punishment are prohibited district-wide, with no exceptions. Staff training in restorative education methods begins this fall." There were no protests, only nods and sighs. And in some cases, quiet tears from teachers who realized too late that silence is a form of agreement. In the following days, Principal Ramirez received letters from other districts. Some asked for Clara's permission to share her story during training sessions. Others asked if she'd be willing to meet with students, not as a guest speaker, but as someone who could show them that brilliance didn't always come with a microphone. He asked her. She said yes, but only once a month. "I still want to do my own homework," she said. He smiled. Of course. At Cal State Bakersfield, a corner of the university library was cleared, just for her. A small desk, a lamp, 2 shelves, no sign, no label, but everyone knew. Sometimes college students would wander past and do a double take. Was that the girl from the news? The one from Sequoia? But Clara didn't notice. She read in silence, took notes, sometimes looked up at the sunlight filtering through the window and whispered formulas to herself like prayers. She was not chasing speed, not glory. She was building a home in her own mind, one theorem, one proof, one mystery at a time. Dr. Torres visited twice a week. They never set a schedule. He simply arrived, and if she was there, they sat. They solved nothing important, and everything essential. Back at Sequoia, something strange had begun. Other students, quiet ones, started staying after school to ask questions, not about exams, about ideas. A boy named Eli brought Clara a sketch of a rocket and asked, "Is this parabola right?" A girl named Myra showed her a story she'd written where math explained grief. "I didn't know numbers could feel like that," Clara said. "I didn't either," Myra smiled. Teachers, too, shifted, slowly. A new poster was pinned in every classroom. "Understanding is louder than answers." Clara didn't know who had written it, but she saw it, and it stayed. The school board offered to hold a formal ceremony. "We want to present your fellowship publicly," they said. "We can invite the press, maybe even the governor." Clara stopped them. "I don't need a microphone," she said, but she had a request. "I want to build something," she said. "Back home." "Home?" "The farm," she said simply. 2 months later, under a sky full of orange dust and the humming of harvest trucks, Clara stood in front of a weathered barn behind her house. She wasn't alone. Her mother stood beside her, sleeves rolled up. Dr. Torres brought books. Aisha brought paint. Principal Ramirez brought his weekend tools and a box of nails. And from around the town, people came, quietly, just like they had come to the meeting. But this time, to build. They cleared the cobwebs, repaired the roof, painted the walls, hung a wooden sign above the door. The Barn of Numbers Free Lessons. Open hearts. Come as you are. Inside there were no desks. Just long wooden tables, a whiteboard, some pillows on the floor, and books donated by the Cal State Math Department. On the far wall, in blue chalk, someone wrote, "Math is not about knowing, it's about wondering." Clara never said who wrote it, but her smile told the truth. And so, the girl who once stood at the back of the room, too hurt to sit, now stood in front of a room built from kindness. She still solved problems. But more importantly, she made space for others to begin. No ceremony could have honored her more than the sound of children laughing beneath a leaky roof, or the way a tired mother smiled from the doorway, whispering, "I never thought my daughter would love learning again." Clara just nodded, then turned back to the whiteboard and picked up the chalk dot. It began with two children, a boy named Diego, who stuttered when called on in class but could recite prime numbers backward to 67, and a girl named Eleni, who never spoke above a whisper, but once drew a perfect hexagon in the dirt using only a stick and string. They came the first afternoon the barn opened, holding hands, not because they were friends, but because neither of them had ever walked into a classroom without fear. Clara waited inside. She had wiped down the tables herself, set out paper and pencils in little chipped mugs. On one wall, she'd hung old multiplication charts, not for teaching, but for comfort, like a familiar quilt. She didn't greet them with a lesson. She simply asked, "What makes numbers hard for you?" Eleni looked at the floor. Diego looked at Eleni, and Clara smiled. "It's okay. You don't have to answer with words." So they didn't. That first day, they just drew shapes, quiet ones, triangles and half-moons and stars with uneven arms. And Clara joined them, tracing her own lines beside theirs. They didn't ask her why she was there. They didn't ask how young she was, because they knew. She was one of them. By the end of the first week, there were 7 students. By the end of the month, 17. Children from every corner of the valley, children whose parents picked fruit, cleaned trailers, worked double shifts at gas stations. Children who had been told not to speak unless they were sure. Children who had never been sure. But now they were coming to the barn, to listen, to wonder, to make mistakes without punishment. Clara never used grades. Instead, she asked questions like, "How steep does a hill feel when you're carrying a box of oranges? If your heart beats faster when you're scared, how would you graph it? What's something you've seen that feels like infinity? And always, what do you want to understand?" Her chalkboard was never full. It held only 1 or 2 ideas at a time, drawn gently, as if each one was a seed. Some days, they didn't do math at all. Some days, they sat in a circle and talked about what it feels like to be told you're wrong before you even try. Clara never corrected them for being wrong. She corrected when they gave up too early. "You can be wrong 100 times," she said once, kneeling beside a little girl whose fractions were all upside down. "But don't you ever leave the page blank." The barn wasn't warm in the winter. It leaked in 2 places, but somehow that made it better. The cold made them bring blankets, and the blankets made them sit close. The leaks made them laugh when they had to move tables mid-lesson, dodging drops like comets. One rainy day, Diego whispered, "Do you think math feels cold sometimes?" Clara smiled. "Maybe at first. But the longer you sit with it, the warmer it gets." Sometimes parents stayed, just outside, listening. They never said much, but they came early to pick up their kids, stood in the doorway longer than needed, Watch their children explain concepts with gestures and sparks in their eyes. One mother, holding a toddler on her hip, whispered to Clara after class, "She comes home with dirt on her knees and algebra in her mouth. I don't know what you're doing to her." Clara smiled. "I'm just giving her a place to ask questions." The woman looked at the barn, the peeling paint, the wonky tables, the light bulb that buzzed too loud, and said, "This place makes her brave." One evening, Dr. Torres visited with a box of old compasses, each wrapped in cloth. "These used to belong to my students," he said. "I kept them, couldn't throw them away." Clara took one. She held it up like a relic, turning it slowly in her hand. "Do they still work?" she asked. Dr. Torres smiled. "Depends on the hands that hold them." They gave one to each child, not as a reward, as a reminder that the circle always comes back around. By spring, college students began visiting. They'd heard about the barn from professors who once taught Torres. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of guilt, having once sat in classrooms where students like Clara were overlooked. But when they entered the barn, none of that mattered. Clara gave them chalk, asked them to sit, then asked them, "When did you stop being curious?" Most didn't have an answer, but they stayed anyway. One afternoon, Clara stayed late to clean. The children had gone. The lantern was still on. Dust danced in its glow. She looked around, at the math games scrawled on the walls, at the chart tracking how many questions had no answers yet, at the photo of her mother taped to the door, smiling, holding a basket of oranges, younger than Clara was now. Then she looked at her notebook, the one she'd carried all this time. She flipped to the first page, the old integral, the one Miss Harding said she had cheated. It was still there, but now it was joined by so much more, scribbled lessons, new ideas, notes from students. "Thank you for making math feel like a story. Now I raise my hand in class. I think I might be smart." Clara didn't cry. She just closed the book and whispered to the quiet barn, "We're just getting started." Some lessons never made it to the board. Some questions were never asked aloud. And some answers, the best ones, came in silence, long after the children had gone home. Clara had learned that not all learning happens in the mind. Some happens in the body, some in the heart. Some in the way you hold a piece of chalk and wait, not to teach, but to listen. One afternoon, Diego, now a little taller, a little louder, stayed behind after the other kids left. He wasn't confused about math. He was confused about something else. "My dad says none of this matters," he said quietly, not looking up. "That school won't change the world. That people like us will always pick fruit, not books." Clara didn't argue. She picked up a piece of chalk and drew a diagonal line on the board. "You know what this is?" she asked. Diego nodded. "A slope. What else could it be?" He blinked. "I don't know. A hill?" Clara smiled. "It's the hill we carry oranges on. It's the path your dad walks at 5 in the morning. It's how tired feels when you walk against it, and how strong feels when you make it anyway." Diego stared at the board. Clara handed him the chalk. "Label it," she said. "Not with numbers, with truth." He wrote one word. "Us." And under it, "Still climbing." That became her new way of teaching. She stopped asking students to solve for X. Instead, she asked, "Where does X show up in your life? What's your unknown? What's your constant? What changes you?" No textbook could answer those, but the students did. Eleni said her constant was her brother, who walked her home every day without being asked. Diego said his unknown was how to make his dad proud without losing himself. A boy named Mateo said his variable was time, It kept moving, no matter how hard he tried to hold it. And Clara said nothing. She just wrote their answers on the board, like constellations. Stars on a dark sky of chalk. Sometimes she sat outside the barn alone at night, barefoot in the dirt, looking up. She didn't know the names of all the stars, but she could draw the curves between them. She could imagine their paths. She could feel how one bright point reached for another, and how the space between them was not emptiness, but relationship. That's what math had become to her now. Not solving, but relating. Not reaching the answer, but staying long enough to understand why the question mattered. One day, a college student from Cal State, a senior named Miriam, visited the barn. She was studying education and had heard about the girl who turned a broken barn into a school. She asked to sit in on a lesson. Clara agreed. That day's lesson wasn't on geometry, or logic, or sequences. It was this. Clara drew a dot on the board. Just one. Then turned to the class. "This is you," she said. Another dot. "This is someone else." Then a line between them. "This is care, attention, time, patience. That's what turns points into paths." She turned to Miriam. "I think people forget that math came from longing," she said. "From the need to measure distance, not just in space, but between hearts." Miriam said nothing, but she stayed until the last child left. Then she asked, "Who taught you to think like this?" Clara smiled. "No one. I just paid attention to how life felt when I didn't understand anything." By summer, the barn had no space left. Children sat on the floor, on crates, on each other's shoes. A parent brought a fan. Another brought lemonade. Someone donated a carpet. And one quiet boy, who had never spoken in public, stood up and said, "I think math is a kind of forgiveness." No one laughed. Clara just said, "Tell me why." He looked at the board, then at his shoes. "Because it lets you try again," he whispered. "Even when you get it wrong." That line stayed on the wall for months. One night, Clara stood under the stars with Dr. Torres beside her. She was holding the old compass he had given her months before. "Do you think I'm still solving things?" she asked. He looked at her, a girl not quite tall enough to be an adult, but already carrying more clarity than most grown men. "No," he said. "I think now you're making space for others to solve themselves." She nodded, then whispered, "Sometimes I miss being a student." He smiled. "You still are. Teachers are just students who teach with more questions." She turned the compass in her hand. It squeaked slightly like an old hinge, but still made perfect circles. Then she looked up. "Do you think stars are real?" she asked. "Of course." "I mean, do you think they're for us?" Dr. Torres took a breath. "I think they are," he said. "But only if we're still curious." She smiled, and that was enough. At the back of her notebook, the one she now kept under lock and key, Clara had begun a new list. Not of formulas, but of sentences whispered by her students. She titled the list, "Proofs of Being Alive." Some of them read, "I asked a question today and didn't feel small. I made a mistake and still got a hug. I found out my brain is bigger than my fear. My dad asked me what I learned and I told him everything." And finally, at the bottom, Clara's own. "I stopped needing to be right. I just wanted everyone to feel possible." The barn was quiet that afternoon. Sunlight filtered in through the crooked slats in thin golden ribbons. Clara stood alone at the front, wiping the board clean. She always cleaned it slowly, not out of ritual, but because she believed each equation deserved a moment to be remembered before it vanished. That day, someone new came in. Small, nervous, shoes too big, hair combed carefully by a mother who probably didn't speak much English. The girl stood by the doorway, holding a folded paper. Permission slip, maybe. Or just a note with her name. Clara turned and smiled. No questions. Just a nod. The girl took a step in, then another, and sat down in the back, quietly, like Clara once had. Her name was Lena. She had come from Guatemala 3 months earlier. Her math record was incomplete. Her English, emerging. Her voice, nearly inaudible. She never raised her hand. She wrote answers in tiny numbers, tucked into the corners of pages. She flinched when called on, but she never missed a single afternoon at the barn. She always sat in the same spot and watched Clara, carefully, like she was trying to memorize not just the math, but the way someone could belong in front of a classroom. One evening, as Clara erased the board and the other students filed out, Lena stayed. She walked to the front, hands shaking, eyes wide. And then, in a voice so soft the wind could have stolen it, she asked, "Will I ever be good at math like you?" The question wasn't about numbers. It was about permission. Permission to hope. To imagine a future where someone like her could step into light and not be laughed at. Clara put the eraser down, walked to her, and knelt. So they were the same height. Then she said the words she had never planned but had always been waiting to say, "Math doesn't care where you're from. It only cares that you're curious." Lena blinked. She looked at the board, still dusted with traces of earlier equations. Then she asked, "Even if I get it wrong?" Clara smiled. "Especially then. That's when it knows you're trying." Lena's lips curled, not fully into a smile, but into something more fragile, belief. And Clara placed a piece of chalk in her hand. "Want to try something?" Lena nodded, and together they drew the simplest thing, a circle. "Perfect," Clara said, and meant it. That night, the barn glowed longer than usual, not because the lights were brighter, but because something had been passed. Not knowledge, but invitation. Months later, during an interview with a local newspaper, a journalist asked Clara, "Do you think you changed the education system in Bakersfield?" Clara shook her head. "No," she said. "The system still has a long way to go." "But you've changed lives," the reporter insisted. Clara looked toward the barn, where chalk still clung to the air like dust, and replied, "I didn't change them. I just stood still long enough for people to see they could move." Years later, the barn of numbers would grow, not in size, but in echoes. Other towns built their own, with different names, different chalk, different children, but they all shared the same story, about a girl who was told to sit down, and instead, she stood "Thank you" for staying until the very last page. In a world that rushes and shouts, the fact that you paused to listen to a 10-year-old girl standing quietly at the back of a classroom, that matters. This story is not about genius. It's about those who still believe in humble intelligence, quiet kindness, and learning that never expires. If you've ever been misunderstood, if you've ever stayed silent in a room that never asked what you thought, if you've ever carried a galaxy inside your mind and no one saw it, then Clara is you. And the barn of numbers is the place you've always been welcome. If you believe this story deserves to be told again, please hit subscribe and leave a note, not for me, but for the child you used to be. Thank you for not looking away, for standing still with her.